So let's try and get an overview now for the flow of lymphatic fluid through the body. What's going on? Well, here we have some lymphatic vessels that we saw. These, of course, will come from the smaller capillaries. So several lymphatic vessels will come together. And at various points in the body, these lymphatic vessels drain into lymph nodes. So here we have, in this case, 3 lymphatic vessels, and they're draining into a lymph node. So here we have a lymph node here. And typically leaving the lymph node you might just have 1, sometimes 2, but we'll just draw 1 vessel draining fluid away from the lymph node. So we've got lymphatic capillaries here feeding into these lymphatic vessels. These of course are going to have valves to make sure that the lymphatic fluid is only flowing in one direction, and it's going to flow into the lymph nodes. Now basically what a lymph node is it's a collection of, it's a reticulum, it's a network, mostly of collagen fibres. So it's a network of collagen fibres. We'll look at it in more detail later on, but if you think of it as a network of collagen fibres. And in these collagen fibres we have lots of white blood cells. We have 2 sorts of white blood cells actually. 2 main sorts. We have lymphocytes and we have macrophages. Now these vessels that drain into a lymph node are called the afferent lymphatic vessels, and the ones that drain away are called the efferent. The efferent lymphatic vessels. So afferent lymphatic vessels are taking lymphatic fluid into a lymph node. E for effluent or E for exit, the efferent vessels are taking the lymphatic fluid away from a lymph node. And as we've noticed, in the lymph node we have lymphocytes and we have macrophages. Now the lymphocytes detect the presence of antigens in the lymphatic fluid. So if there's any viruses or bacteria in the lymphatic fluid, that will be detected by the lymphocytes. And it's the lymphocytes that actually produce the antibodies. The antibodies are the immune proteins. They are immunoglobulins. So the lymphocytes are going to produce immune proteins, immune antibodies, which will combat the antigen, the mechanism of specific immunity. And the macrophages will directly phagocytose antigenic material. So any viruses or bacteria that are drained from the tissues in the lymphatic flow are going to go into the lymph node, stimulate the production of an immune response, and be phagocytosed by the macrophages. So in the lymph node we have this reticulum, this network, with lots of leukocytes, lots of types of white blood cells in that network, holding it there. And this reticular network is doing 2 things. It's forming a physical sieve. So as the fluid comes in the afferent lymphatic vessels, it's going to be sieved and filtered through to the efferent lymphatic vessels. But also it's forming a habitat for all of the lymphocytes and macrophages, which are the very cells which are designed to attack any infectious material. So you can see that the lymph node is a real lion's den if you're a bacteria. You're going to get eaten up and immune proteins are going to be made which act against you. So it's a very important defence mechanism. So all the fluid coming in the afferent lymphatics filtered through the reticular collagen network, exposed to lymphocytes, exposed to macrophages. That means that any infection which does get in here is probably not going to get passed into the efferent lymphatics. So this is a way of sterilising any tissue fluid before it gets into the efferent lymphatic vessel. Now these efferent lymphatic vessels, several of them are going to join up to form larger lymphatic vessels called lymphatic trunks. And eventually these form very large lymphatic vessels called lymphatic ducts. And we'll see these in more detail later, but for now, let's notice that the lymphatic ducts drain into large veins. So here we have a large vein here, and the lymphatic fluid will drain into efferent lymphatics, larger lymphatic trunks, eventually into lymphatic ducts, and that will drain back into the venous circulation. So that means that any fluid that's absorbed from the tissues must go through these lymphatic defences before it gets back into the blood. That means if there's a bacterial infection in the tissues, as long as these lymphatic defences are doing their job, means that a bacterial infection in the tissues will not result in a bacteremia. Because once bacteria get into the blood, they can spread all around the body and cause nasty systemic infection. So we need to be protected against that, and that's exactly what these lymph nodes with their protective white blood cells do. So tissue fluid formed in the lymphatic capillaries, afferent vessels filtering through the lymph nodes, any infection removed, fluid going onto the efferent lymphatics, progressively larger vessels before being eventually returned to the systemic blood circulation. What we're looking at here is a diagram of the heart. So here's the arterial blood pumping into the arterial circulation from the left ventricle, going through the arterial system into the capillaries of the body. And of course, as the blood goes through the capillaries of the body, it gives up its oxygen and it picks up carbon dioxide. So here we see the blood draining from the venous ends of the capillary into the venules and into progressively larger veins, going back, in the case of the systemic circulation, into the right atrium. And we notice here that tissue fluid is being formed, particularly at the arterial end of the capillary. So here we have the tissue cells in black, and here we have the tissue fluid forming. As we've noted before, most is simply reabsorbed back into the venous end of the capillary, but some of the tissue fluid is not, especially larger molecules which might have escaped from the tissue fluid, the proteins. They drain into the lymphatic capillaries here. Blind-ended lymphatic capillaries in the tissues. These contract to move the fluid away into progressively larger lymphatic vessels. And as we see here, there are valves in these lymphatic vessels that ensure a one-way flow. So that valve is opening that way like that and closing that way. So that means when the pressure here increases, the lymphatic fluid can go from this compartment here into that compartment there. But if that compartment contracts, if that compartment there contracts, well, it could contract actively on its own because we've got contractile elements in the wall, or it could be compressed by a muscle, or it could be compressed by an adjacent artery. That's going to be compressed. That's going to close that lymphatic valve there, but open that one. So we're going to get flow of the lymphatic fluid. Then lymphatic fluid from several afferent vessels is going to go to the lymph node. It's going to go through the reticulum within the lymph node, running the gauntlet of the white cells which are in the lymph node. It's going to drain into an efferent lymphatic vessel, and the efferent lymphatic vessel is going to go into progressive larger vessels, and eventually the lymphatic fluid is going to drain back into the systemic venous circulation. So here we have the complete flow of lymphatic fluid. Tissue fluid is exuded from the capillary into the interstitial space. When it goes into the lymphatic vessel, it's called lymph. That flows through the lymphatic system. Any infection is removed. Then once it's been through the lymphatic system, it's going to drain back into the systemic venous system. So we've got a complete circulation. We've got the circulation of the blood going on all the time, and we've also got the circulation of the interstitial fluid going into the lymphatic vessels, going round and back into the venous circulation. So really we've got two circulatory systems here. We've got the blood circulatory system, and although it's going to work much more slowly, we've got a lymphatic circulatory system as well. So here we see a single lymph node. It's got a capsule around about the outside, around here, fibrous tissue, and these projections go in called trabeculae into the lymph node to sort of compartmentalise it. And we've noticed that there's reticular networks in here. And this contains a lot of lymphocytes and macrophages. So lots of white cells, lymphocytes, macrophages throughout, particularly in some middle bits there's lots of lymphocytes and macrophages. Very inhospitable environment if you happen to be a bacteria. So fluid, lymphatic fluid is draining in here, in the afferent lymphatic vessels, percolating through and draining out here into the efferent lymphatic vessel. Now the lymph nodes in the body tend to occur in clusters. Now some people call them lymph glands. Technically that's wrong. They're not glands, they are nodes. So what we see here is we have the pericranial lymph nodes around about the base of the head. Then in the neck we have groups of cervical lymph nodes. Then these deep nodes here are associated with the trachea. These are the tracheal lymph nodes. In both armpits we have the axillary groups of lymph nodes. Particularly around about the abdominal aorta, we have deep aortic related lymph nodes. Here in the groin, we have the inguinal groups of lymph nodes. And then further down here, we have the femoral lymph nodes. Now in the head and neck, there's probably something like 60 to 70 lymph nodes. In the thorax there's something like 100 lymph nodes, and in the abdomen and the pelvis there's probably about 250 lymph nodes. So there's several hundred lymph nodes in the body, but largely arranged in these clusters.